ROBUR, the Conqueror, Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 6. The President and Secretary suspend hostilities. A bandage over the eyes, a gag in the mouth, a cord round the wrists, a cord round the ankles, unable to see, to speak, or to move. Uncle Prudent, Phil Evans, and Fry Colin were anything but pleased with their position. Knowing not who had seized them, nor in what they had been thrown like parcels in a goods wagon, nor where they were, nor what was reserved for them, it was enough to exasperate even the most patient of the ovine race, and we know that the members of the Weldon Institute were not precisely sheep as far as patience went. With his violence of character, we can easily imagine how Uncle Prudent felt. One thing was evident, that Phil Evans and he would find it difficult to attend the club next evening. As to Fry Colin, with his eyes shut and his mouth closed, it was impossible for him to think of anything. He was more dead than alive. For an hour the position of the prisoners remained unchanged. No one came to visit them or to give them that liberty of movement and speech of which they lay in such need. They were reduced to stifled sighs, to grunts emitted over and under their gags, to everything that betrayed anger kept dumb and fury imprisoned, or rather bound down. Then, after many fruitless efforts, they remained for some time as though lifeless. Then, as the sense of sight was denied them, they tried by their sense of hearing to obtain some indication of the nature of this disquieting state of things. But in vain did they seek for any other sound than an interminable and inexplicable FRRR, which seemed to envelop them in a quivering atmosphere. At last, something happened. Phil Evans, regaining his coolness, managed to slacken the cord which bound his wrists. Little by little the knot slipped, his fingers slipped over each other, and his hands regained their usual freedom. A vigorous rubbing restored the circulation. A moment after he had slipped off the bandage which bound his eyes, taken the gag out of his mouth, and cut the cords round his ankles with his knife. An American who has not a Bowie knife in his pocket is no longer an American. But if Phil Evans had regained the power of moving and speaking, that was all. His eyes were useless to him, at present at any rate. The prison was quite dark, though about 6 feet above him a feeble gleam of light came in through a kind of loophole. As may be imagined, Phil Evans did not hesitate to at once set free his rival. A few cuts with the Bowie settled the knots which bound him foot and hand. Immediately Uncle Prudent rose to his knees and snatched away his bandage and gag. "Thanks," said he in stifled voice. "Phil Evans? Uncle Prudent? Here we are no longer the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute. We are adversaries no more." "You are right," answered Evans. "We are now only 2 men agreed to avenge ourselves on a third whose attempt deserves severe reprisals, and this third is ROBUR. It is ROBUR?" On this point, both were absolutely in accord. On this subject, there was no fear of dispute. "And your servant," said Phil Evans, pointing to Fry Colin, who was puffing like a grampus. "We must set him free." "Not yet," said Uncle Prudent. "He would overwhelm us with his jeremiads, and we have something else to do than abuse each other." "What is that, Uncle Prudent?" "To save ourselves, if possible." "You are right, even if it is impossible." "And even if it is impossible?" There could be no doubt that this kidnapping was due to ROBUR, for an ordinary thief would have relieved them of their watches, jewelry, and purses, and thrown their bodies into the Schuylkill with a good gash in their throats, instead of throwing them to the bottom of what? That was a serious question, which would have to be answered before attempting an escape with any chance of success. "Phil Evans," began Uncle Prudent, "if, when we came away from our meeting, instead of indulging in amenities to which we need not recur, we had kept our eyes more open, this would not have happened. Had we remained in the streets of Philadelphia, there would have been none of this. Evidently ROBUR foresaw what would happen at the club, and had placed some of his bandits on guard at the door. When we left Walnut Street, these fellows must have watched us and followed us, and when we imprudently ventured into Fairmount Park, they went in for their little game." "Agreed," said Evans. "We were wrong not to go straight home." "It is always wrong not to be right," said Prudent. Here a long-drawn sigh escaped from the darkest corner of the prison. "What is that?" asked Evans. "Nothing. Fry Colin is dreaming." Between the moment we were seized a few steps out into the clearing and the moment we were thrown in here only 2 minutes elapsed. It is thus evident that those people did not take us out of Fairmount Park. And if they had done so, we should have felt we were being moved. Undoubtedly, and consequently, we must be in some vehicle, perhaps some of those long prairie wagons, or some show caravan. Evidently, for if we were in a boat moored on the Schuylkill, we should have noticed the movement due to the current. That is so, and as we are still in the clearing, I think that now is the time to get away, and we can return later to settle with this ROBUR. And make him pay for this attempt on the liberty of 2 citizens of the United States. And he shall pay pretty dearly. But who is this man? Where does he come from? Is he English, or German, or French? "He is a scoundrel, that is enough," said Uncle Prudent. "Now to work." And then the 2 men, with their hands stretched out and their fingers wide apart, began to feel round the walls to find a joint or crack. Nothing. Nothing. Not even at the door. It was closely shut, and it was impossible to shoot back the lock. All that could be done was to make a hole and escape through the hole. It remained to be seen if the knives could cut into the walls. "But whence comes this never-ending rustling?" asked Evans, who was much impressed at the continuous effort. "The wind, doubtless," said Uncle Prudent. "The wind! But I thought the night was quite calm." "So it was. But if it isn't the wind, what can it be?" Phil Evans got out the best blade of his knife and set to work on the wall near the door. Perhaps he might make a hole which would enable him to open it from the outside, should it be only bolted, or should the key have been left in the lock. He worked away for some minutes. The only result was to nip up his knife, to snip off its point, and transform what was left of the blade into a saw. "Doesn't it cut?" asked Uncle Prudent. "No." "Is the wall made of sheet iron?" "No. It gives no metallic sound when you hit it." "Is it of ironwood?" "No, it isn't iron, and it isn't wood." "What is it, then?" "Impossible to say. But anyhow, steel doesn't touch it." Uncle Prudent, in a sudden outburst of fury, began to rave and stamp on the sonorous planks, while his hands sought to strangle an imaginary ROBUR. "Be calm, Prudent, be calm. You have a try." Uncle Prudent had a try, but the bowie knife could do nothing against a wall which its best blades could not even scratch. The wall seemed to be made of crystal. So it became evident that all flight was impracticable except through the door, and for a time they must resign themselves to their fate, not a very pleasant thing for the Yankee temperament, and very much to the disgust of these eminently practical men. But this conclusion was not arrived at without many objurgations and loud-sounding phrases hurled at this ROBUR, who, from what had been seen of him at the Weldon Institute, was not the sort of man to trouble himself much about them. Suddenly, Fry Colin began to give unequivocal signs of being unwell. He began to writhe in a most lamentable fashion, either with cramp in his stomach or in his limbs, and Uncle Prudent, thinking it his duty to put an end to these gymnastics, cut the cords that bound him. He had cause to be sorry for it. Immediately there was poured forth an interminable litany in which the terrors of fear were mingled with the tortures of hunger. Fry Colin was no worse in his brain than in his stomach, and it would have been difficult to decide to which organ the chief cause of the trouble should be assigned. "Fry Colin," said Uncle Prudent. Master Uncle," answered the negro between 2 of his lugubrious howls. "It is possible that we are doomed to die of hunger in this prison, but we have made up our minds not to succumb until we have availed ourselves of every means of alimentation to prolong our lives." "To eat me?" exclaimed Fry Colin. "As is always done with a negro under such circumstances, so you had better not make yourself too obvious." "Or you'll have your bones picked," said Evans. And as Fry Colin saw he might be used to prolong 2 existences more precious than his own, he contented himself thenceforth with groaning in quiet. The time went on, and all attempts to force the door or get through the wall proved fruitless. What the wall was made of was impossible to say. It was not metal, it was not wood, It was not stone, and all the cell seemed to be made of the same stuff. When they stamped on the floor, it gave a peculiar sound that Uncle Prudent found it difficult to describe. The floor seemed to sound hollow, as if it was not resting directly on the ground of the clearing, and the inexplicable FRRRR seemed to sweep along below it, all of which was rather alarming. "Uncle Prudent," said Phil Evans. "Well, do you think our prison has been moved at all?" "Not that I know of. Because when we were first caught, I distinctly remember the fresh fragrance of the grass and the resinous odor of the park trees, while now, when I take in a good sniff of the air, it seems as though all that had gone." "So it has. Why?" "We cannot say why unless we admit that the prison has moved, and I say again that if the prison had moved, either as a vehicle on the road or a boat on the stream, we should have felt it." Here Fry Colin gave vent to a long groan, which might have been taken for his last, had he not followed it up with several more. "I expect ROBUR will soon have us brought before him," said Phil Evans. "I hope so," said Uncle Prudent, "and I shall tell him—" "What?" "That he began by being rude and ended in being unbearable." Here Phil Evans noticed that day was beginning to break. A gleam, still faint, filtered through the narrow window opposite the door. It ought thus to be about 4 o'clock in the morning, for it is at that hour in the month of June, in this latitude, that the horizon of Philadelphia is tinged by the first rays of the dawn. But when Uncle Prudent sounded his repeater, which was a masterpiece from his colleague's factory, the tiny gong only gave 3:15, and the watch had not stopped. "That is strange," said Phil Evans. "At 3:15, it ought still to be night." "Perhaps my watch has got slow," answered Uncle Prudent. "A watch of the Wheelton Watch Company," exclaimed Phil Evans. Whatever might be the reason, there was no doubt that the day was breaking. Gradually, the window became white in the deep darkness of the cell. However, if the dawn appeared sooner than the 40th parallel permitted, it did not advance with the rapidity peculiar to lower latitudes. This was another observation of Uncle Prudent's, a new, inexplicable phenomenon. "Couldn't we get up to the window and see where we are?" "We might," said Uncle Prudent. "Fry Colin, get up." The Negro arose. "Put your back against the wall," continued Prudent, "and you, Evans, get on his shoulders while I buttress him up." "Right," said Evans. An instant afterwards, his knees were on Fry Colin's shoulders, and his eyes were level with the window. The window was not of lenticular glass like those on shipboard, but was a simple flat pane. It was small, and Phil Evans found his range of view was much limited. "Break the glass," said Prudent, "and perhaps you will be able to see better." Phil Evans gave it a sharp knock with the handle of his bowie knife. It gave back a silvery sound, but it did not break. Another and more violent blow. The same result. "It is unbreakable glass," said Evans. It appeared as though the pane was made of glass, toughened on the Siemens system, as after several blows it remained intact. The light had now increased, and Phil Evans could see for some distance within the radius allowed by the frame. "What do you see?" asked Uncle Prudent. "Nothing." "What? Not any trees?" "No." "Not even the top branches?" "No." "Then we are not in the clearing?" "Neither in the clearing nor in the park." "Don't you see any roofs of houses or monuments?" said Prudent, whose disappointment and anger were increasing rapidly. "No." "What? Not a flagstaff, nor a church tower, nor a chimney?" "Nothing but space." As he uttered the words, the door opened. A man appeared on the threshold. It was ROBUR. "Honorable balloonists," he said in a serious voice, "you are now free to go and come as you like." "Free?" exclaimed Uncle Prudent. "Yes, within the limits of the Albatross." Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans rushed out of their prison. And what did they see? 4,000 feet below them, the face of a country they sought in vain to recognize. Chapter 7. On board the Albatross. When will man cease to crawl in the depths, to live in the azure and quiet of the sky? To this question of Camille Flammarion's, the answer is easy. It will be when the progress of mechanics has enabled us to solve the problem of aviation. And in a few years, as we can foresee, a more practical utilization of electricity will do much towards that solution. In 1783, before the Montgolfier brothers had built their fire balloon and Charles, the physician, had devised his first aerostat, a few adventurous spirits had dreamt of the conquest of space by mechanical means. The first inventors did not think of apparatus lighter than air, for that the science of their time did not allow them to imagine. It was to contrivances heavier than air, to flying machines in imitation of the birds, that they trusted to realize aerial locomotion. This was exactly what had been done by that madman Icarus, the son of Daedalus, whose wings, fixed together with wax, had melted as they approached the sun. But without going back to mythological times, without dwelling on Archytas of Tarentum, we find, in the works of Dante of Perugia, of Leonardo da Vinci and Guidotti, the idea of machines made to move through the air. 2 centuries and a half afterwards, inventors began to multiply. In 1742, the Marquis de Bacqueville designed a system of wings, tried it over the Seine, and fell and broke his arm. In 1768, Paucton conceived the idea of an apparatus with 2 screws, suspensive and propulsive. In 1781, Meerwein, the architect of the Prince of Baden, built an orthopteric machine and protested against the tendency of the aerostats, which had just been invented. In 1784, Launoy and Bienvenu had maneuvered a helicopter worked by springs. In 1708, there were the attempts at flight by the Austrian Jacques Deguenne. In 1810 came the pamphlet by Denian of Nantes, in which the principles of heavier than air are laid down. From 1811 to 1840 came the inventions and researches of Derblinger, Vigual, Sarti, Dubochet, and Cagnard de Latour. In 1842 we have the Englishman Henson, with his system of inclined planes and screws worked by steam. In 1845 came Kossuth and his ascensional screws. In 1847 came Camille Vert and his helicopter made of birds' wings. In 1852 came Latour with his system of guidable parachutes, whose trial cost him his life. And in the same year came Michel Lou with his plan of gliding through the air on 4 revolving wings. In 1853 came Beleguic and his aeroplane with the traction screws, Voisin Chardin with his guidable kite, and George Corley with his flying machines driven by gas. From 1854 to 1863 appeared Joseph Pline with several patents for aerial systems. Bréant, Carlingford, Lebris, Du Temple, Bright, whose ascensional screws were left-handed, Smithies, Panafieux, Grosnier, etc. At length, in 1863, thanks to the efforts of Nadar, a society of heavier than air was founded in Paris. There the inventors could experiment with the machines, of which many were patented. Ponton d'Amicourt and his steam helicopter, Lalandelle and his system of combining screws with inclined planes and parachutes, Louvrier and his aeroscape, Esterno and his mechanical bird, Grouf and his apparatus with wings worked by levers. The impetus was given, inventors invented, calculators calculated all that could render aerial locomotion practicable. Burckhardt, Lebris, Kaufmann, Smith, Stringfellow, Prigent, Danjard, Pomez, and Delapose, Moi, Penaud, Jobert, Aurault de Villeneuve, Achenbach, Garapon, Duchesne, Danduran, Pariessel, Dieuede, Melkisef, Forlanini, Béret, Tatin, Dandrieux, Edison, some with wings or screws, others with inclined planes, imagined, created, constructed, perfected, their flying machines, ready to do their work, once there came to be applied, to thereby some inventor a motor of adequate power and excessive lightness. This list may be a little long, but that will be forgiven, for it is necessary to give the various steps in the ladder of aerial locomotion, on the top of which appeared ROBUR the Conqueror. Without these attempts, these experiments of his predecessors, how could the inquirer have conceived so perfect an apparatus? And though he had but contempt for those who obstinately worked away in the direction of balloons, he held in high esteem all those partisans of heavier than air. English, American, Italian, Austrian, French, and particularly French, whose work had been perfected by him and led him to design and then to build this flying engine known as the albatross, which he was guiding through the currents of the atmosphere. "The pigeon flies," had exclaimed one of the most persistent adepts at aviation. "They will crowd the air as they crowd the earth," said one of his most excited partisans. "From the locomotive to the aeromotive," shouted the noisiest of all, who had turned on the trumpet of publicity to awaken the old and new worlds. Nothing, in fact, is better established by experiment and calculation than that the air is highly resistant. A circumference of only a yard in diameter in the shape of a parachute can not only impede descent in air, but can render it isochronous. That is a fact. It is equally well known that when the speed is great, the work of the weight varies in almost inverse ratio to the square of the speed, and therefore becomes almost insignificant. It is also known that as the weight of a flying animal increases, the less is the proportional increase in the surface beaten by the wings in order to sustain it, although the motion of the wings becomes slower. A flying machine must therefore be constructed to take advantage of these natural laws, to imitate the bird, that admirable type of aerial locomotion, according to Dr. Marcy of the Institute of France. In short, the contrivances likely to solve the problem are of three kinds. 1. Helicopters or spiralifers, which are simply screws with vertical axes. 2. Ornithopters, machines which endeavor to reproduce the natural flight of birds. 3. Aeroplanes, which are merely inclined planes like kites, but towed or driven by screws. Each of these systems has had, and still has it, partisans obstinately resolved to give way in not the slightest particular. However, ROBUR, for many reasons, had rejected the two first. The ornithopter, or mechanical bird, offers certain advantages, no doubt. That the work and experiments of M. Renard in 1884 have sufficiently proved. But, as has been said, it is not necessary to copy nature servilely. Locomotives are not copied from the hare, nor are ships copied from the fish. To the first we have put wheels which are not legs, to the second we have put screws which are not fins, and they do not do so badly. Besides, what is this mechanical movement in the flight of birds, whose action is so complex? Has not Dr. Marcy suspected that the feathers open during the return of the wings so as to let the air through them? And is not that rather a difficult operation for an artificial machine? On the other hand, aeroplanes have given many good results. Screws opposing a slanting plane to the bed of air will produce an ascensional movement, and the models experimented on have shown that the disposable weight, that is to say the weight it is possible to deal with as distinct from that of the apparatus, increases with the square of the speed. Herein the aeroplane has the advantage over the aerostat, even when the aerostat is furnished with the means of locomotion. Nevertheless, ROBUR had thought that the simpler his contrivance, the better, and the screws, the St. Helices, that had been thrown in his teeth at the Weldon Institute, had sufficed for all the needs of his flying machine. One series could hold it suspended in the air, the other could drive it along under conditions that were marvelously adapted for speed and safety. If the ornithopter, striking like the wings of a bird, raised itself by beating the air, the helicopter raised itself by striking the air obliquely, with the fins of the screw as it mounted on an inclined plane. These fins, or arms, are in reality wings, but wings disposed as a helix instead of as a paddle wheel. The helix advances in the direction of its axis. Is the axis vertical? Then it moves vertically. Is the axis horizontal? Then it moves horizontally. The whole of ROBUR's flying apparatus depended on these two movements, as will be seen from the following detailed description, which can be divided under three heads: the platform, the engines of suspension and propulsion, and the machinery. Platform. This was a framework 100 feet long and 12 wide, a ship's deck in fact, with a projecting prow. Beneath was a hull solidly built, enclosing the engines, stores and provisions of all sorts, including the water tanks. Round the deck a few light uprights supported a wire trellis that did duty for bulwarks. On the deck were three houses whose compartments were used as cabins for the crew or as machine rooms. In the centre house was the machine which drove the suspensory helices, in that forward was the machine that drove the bow screw, in that aft was the machine that drove the stern screw. In the bow were the cook's galley and the crew's quarters. In the stern were several cabins, including that of the engineer, the saloon, and above them all a glass house in which stood the helmsman, who steered the vessel by means of a powerful rudder. All these cabins were lighted by portholes filled with toughened glass, which has 10 times the resistance of ordinary glass. Beneath the hull was a system of flexible springs to ease off the concussion when it became advisable to land, engines of suspension and propulsion. Above the deck rose 37 vertical axes, 15 along each side, and 7 more elevated in the center. The albatross might be called a clipper with 37 masts. But these masts, instead of sails, bore each 2 horizontal screws, not very large in spread or diameter, but driven at prodigious speed. Each of these axes had its own movement independent of the rest, and each alternate one spun round in a different direction from the others so as to avoid any tendency to gyration. Hence the screws, as they rose on the vertical column of air, retained their equilibrium by their horizontal resistance. Consequently, the apparatus was furnished with 74 suspensory screws, whose 3 branches were connected by a metallic circle which economized their motive force. In front and behind, mounted on horizontal axes, were 2 propelling screws, each with 4 arms. These screws were of much larger diameter than the suspensory ones, but could be worked at quite their speed. In fact, the vessel combined the systems of Cossus, La Landelle, and Ponton d'Amicourt as perfected by ROBUR. But it was in the choice and application of his motive force that he could claim to be an inventor. Machinery. ROBUR had not availed himself of the vapor of water or other liquids, nor compressed air and other mechanical motion. He employed electricity, that agent which one day will be the soul of the industrial world. But he required no electro-motor to produce it. All he trusted to was piles and accumulators. What were the elements of these piles, and what were the acids he used, ROBUR only knew, and the construction of the accumulators was kept equally secret. Of what were their positive and negative plates? None can say. The engineer took good care, and not unreasonably, to keep his secret unpatented. One thing was unmistakable, and that was that the piles were of extraordinary strength, and the accumulators left those of Forcell and Volkmar very far behind in yielding currents whose amperes ran into figures up to then unknown. Thus there was obtained a power to drive the screws and communicate a suspending and propelling force in excess of all his requirements under any circumstances. But it is as well to repeat it, this belonged entirely to ROBUR. He kept it a close secret, and, if the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute did not happen to discover it, it would probably be lost to humanity. It need not be shown that the apparatus possessed sufficient stability. Its center of gravity proved that at once. There was no danger of its making alarming angles with the horizontal, still less of its capsizing. And now for the metal used by ROBUR in the construction of his aeronef, a name which can be exactly applied to the albatross. What was this material, so hard that the bowie knife of Phil Evans could not scratch it, and Uncle Prudent could not explain its nature? Simply paper. For some years this fabrication had been making considerable progress. Unsized paper, with the sheets impregnated with dextrin and starch and squeezed in hydraulic presses, will form a material as hard as steel. There are made of it pulleys, rails, and wagon wheels, much more solid than metal wheels, and far lighter. And it was this lightness and solidity which ROBUR availed himself of in building his aerial locomotive. Everything, framework, hull, houses, cabins, were made of straw paper turned hard as metal by compression, and, what was not to be despised in an apparatus flying at great heights, incombustible. The different parts of the engines and the screws were made of gelatinized fiber, which combined in sufficient degree flexibility with resistance. This material could be used in every form. It was insoluble in most gases and liquids, acids or essences, to say nothing of its insulating properties, and it proved most valuable in the electric machinery of the Albatross. ROBUR, his mate Tom Turner, an engineer and two assistants, two steersmen and a cook, 8 men all told, formed the crew of the aeronef and proved ample for all the maneuvers required in aerial navigation. There were arms of the chase and of war, fishing appliances, electric lights, instruments of observation, compasses and sextants for checking the course, thermometers for studying the temperature, different barometers, some for estimating the heights attained, others for indicating the variations of atmospheric pressure, a storm glass for forecasting tempests, a small library, a portable printing press, a field piece mounted on a pivot, breech loading and throwing a 3-inch shell, a supply of powder, bullets, dynamite cartridges, a cooking stove, warmed by currents from the accumulators, a stock of preserves, meats and vegetables sufficient to last for months. Such were the outfit and stores of the aeronef, in addition to the famous trumpet. There was besides a light India-rubber boat, insubmersible, which could carry 8 men on the surface of a river, a lake, or a calm sea. But were there any parachutes in case of accident? Number ROBUR did not believe in accidents of that kind. The axes of the screws were independent. The stoppage of a few would not affect the motion of the others, and if only half were working, the Albatross could still keep afloat in her natural element. "And with her," said ROBUR to his guests in spite of themselves, "I am master of the 7th part of the world, larger than Africa, Oceania, Asia, America, and Europe, this aerial Icarian sea, which millions of Icarians will one day people." Chapter 8. The balloonists refused to be convinced. The president of the Weldon Institute was stupefied. His companion was astonished. But neither of them would allow any of their very natural amazement to be visible. The valet Fry Colin did not conceal his terror at finding himself borne through space on such a machine, and he took no pains whatever to hide it. The suspensory screws were rapidly spinning overhead. Fast as they were going, they would have to triple their speed if the Albatross was to ascend to higher zones. The 2 propellers were running very easily and driving the ship at about 11 knots an hour. As they leaned over the rail, the passengers of the Albatross could perceive a long, sinuous liquid ribbon which meandered like a mere brook through a varied country, amid the gleaming of many lagoons, obliquely struck by the rays of the sun. The brook was a river, one of the most important in that district. Along its left bank was a chain of mountains extending out of sight. "And will you tell us where we are?" asked Uncle Prudent, in a voice tremulous with anger. "I have nothing to teach you," answered ROBUR. "And will you tell us where we are going?" asked Phil Evans. "Through space." "And how long will that last?" "Until it ends." "Are we going round the world?" asked Phil Evans, ironically. "Further than that," said ROBUR. "And if this voyage does not suit us?" asked Uncle Prudent. "It will have to suit you." That is a foretaste of the nature of the relations that were to obtain between the master of the Albatross and his guests, not to say his prisoners. Manifestly, he wished to give them time to cool down, to admire the marvelous apparatus which was bearing them through the air, and doubtless to compliment the inventor. And so he went off to the other end of the deck, leaving them to examine the arrangement of the machinery and the management of the ship, or to give their whole attention to the landscape which was unrolling beneath them. "Uncle Prudent," said Evans, "unless I am mistaken, we are flying over central Canada. That river in the northwest is the Saint Lawrence. That town we are leaving behind is Quebec." It was indeed the old city of Champlain, whose zinc roofs were shining like reflectors in the sun. The Albatross must thus have reached the 46th degree of north latitude, and thus was explained the premature advance of the day with the abnormal prolongation of the dawn. "Yes," said Phil Evans, "there is the town in its amphitheatre, the hill with its citadel, the Gibraltar of North America. There are the cathedrals. There is the custom house with its dome surmounted by the British flag." Phil Evans had not finished before the Canadian city began to slip into the distance. The clipper entered a zone of light clouds, which gradually shut off a view of the ground. "ROBUR," seeing that the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute had directed their attention to the external arrangements of the Albatross, walked up to them and said, "Well, gentlemen, do you believe in the possibility of aerial locomotion by machines heavier than air?" It would have been difficult not to succumb to the evidence, but Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans did not reply. "You are silent," continued the engineer. "Doubtless hunger makes you dumb. But if I undertook to carry you through the air, I did not think of feeding you on such a poorly nutritive fluid. Your first breakfast is waiting for you." As Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans were feeling the pangs of hunger somewhat keenly, they did not care to stand upon ceremony. A meal would commit them to nothing, and when ROBUR put them back on the ground, they could resume full liberty of action. And so they followed into a small dining room in the aftermost house. There they found a well-laid table at which they could take their meals during the voyage. There were different preserves, and, among other things, was a sort of bread made of equal parts of flour and meat, reduced to powder, and worked together with a little lard, which boiled in water made excellent soup. And there were rashers of fried ham, and for drink there was tea. Neither had Fry Colin been forgotten. He was taken forward, and there found some strong soup made of this bread. In truth, he had to be very hungry to eat at all, for his jaws shook with fear and almost refused to work. "If it was to break! If it was to break!" said the unfortunate Negro. Hence continual faintings. Only think, a fall of over 4,000 feet, which would smash him to a jelly. An hour afterwards, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans appeared on the deck. ROBUR was no longer there. At the stem, the man at the wheel in his glass cage, his eyes fixed on the compass, followed imperturbably without hesitation the route given by the engineer. As for the rest of the crew, breakfast probably kept them from their posts. An assistant engineer, examining the machinery, went from one house to the other. If the speed of the ship was great, the two colleagues could only estimate it imperfectly, for the Albatross had passed through the cloud zone which the sun showed some 4,000 feet below. "I can hardly believe it," said Phil Evans. "Don't believe it," said Uncle Prudent, and going to the bow they looked out towards the western horizon. "Another town," said Phil Evans. "Do you recognize it?" "Yes, it seems to me to be Montreal." "Montreal? But we only left Quebec 2 hours ago." "That proves that we must be going at a speed of 75 miles an hour." Such was the speed of the aeronef, and if the passengers were not inconvenienced by it, it was because they were going with the wind. In a calm, such speed would have been difficult, and the rate would have sunk to that of an express. In a headwind, the speed would have been unbearable. Phil Evans was not mistaken. Below the Albatross appeared Montreal, easily recognizable by the Victoria Bridge, a tubular bridge thrown over the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence like the railway viaduct over the Venice Lagoon. Soon they could distinguish the town's wide streets, its huge shops, its palatial banks, its cathedral, recently built on the model of St. Peter's at Rome, and then Mount Royal, which commands the city and forms a magnificent park. Luckily, Phil Evans had visited the chief towns of Canada and could recognize them without asking ROBUR. After Montreal, they passed Ottawa, whose falls, seen from above, looked like a vast cauldron in ebullition, throwing off masses of steam with grand effect. "There is the Parliament House," and he pointed out a sort of Nuremberg toy planted on a hilltop. This toy, with its polychrome architecture, resembled the House of Parliament in London, much as the Montreal Cathedral resembles St. Peter's at Rome. But that was of no consequence. There could be no doubt it was Ottawa. Soon the city faded off towards the horizon and formed but a luminous spot on the ground. It was almost 2 hours before ROBUR appeared. His mate, Tom Turner, accompanied him. He said only 3 words. These were transmitted to the 2 assistant engineers in the fore and aft engine houses. At a sign, the helmsman changed the direction of the Albatross a couple of points to the southwest. At the same time, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans felt that a greater speed had been given to the propellers. In fact, the speed had been doubled and now surpassed anything that had ever been attained by terrestrial engines. Torpedo boats do their 22 knots an hour. Railway trains do their 60 miles an hour. The iceboats on the frozen Hudson do their 65 miles an hour. A machine built by the Patterson Company with a cogged wheel has done its 80 miles, and another locomotive between Trenton and Jersey City has done its 84. But the Albatross, at full speed, could do her 120 miles an hour, or 176 feet per second. This speed is that of the storm which tears up trees by the roots. It is the mean speed of the carrier pigeon, and is only surpassed by the flight of the swallow, 220 feet per second, and that of the swift, 274 feet per second. In a word, as ROBUR had said, the Albatross, by using the whole force of her screws, could make the tour of the globe in 200 hours, or less than 8 days. Is it necessary to say so? The phenomenon whose appearance had so much puzzled the people of both worlds was the aeronef of the engineer. The trumpet, which blared its startling fanfares through the air, was that of the mate, Tom Turner. The flag planted on the chief monuments of Europe, Asia, America, was the flag of ROBUR the Conqueror and his Albatross. And if up to then the engineer had taken many precautions against being recognized, if by preference he travelled at night, clearing the way with his electric lights, and during the day vanishing into the zones above the clouds, he seemed now to have no wish to keep his secret hidden. And if he had come to Philadelphia and presented himself at the meeting of the Weldon Institute, was it not that they might share in his prodigious discovery and convince ipso facto the most incredulous? We know how he had been received, and we see what reprisals he had taken on the president and secretary of the club. Again did ROBUR approach his prisoners, who affected to be in no way surprised at what they saw of what had succeeded in spite of them. Evidently, beneath the cranium of these two Anglo-Saxon heads, there was a thick crust of obstinacy, which would not be easy to remove. On his part, ROBUR did not seem to notice anything particular, and coolly continued the conversation which he had begun 2 hours before. "Gentlemen," said he, "you ask yourselves doubtless if this apparatus, so marvellously adapted for aerial locomotion, is susceptible of receiving greater speed. It is not worthwhile to conquer space if we cannot devour it. I wanted the air to be a solid support to me, and it is. I saw that to struggle against the wind I must be stronger than the wind, and I am. I had no need of sails to drive me, nor oars, nor wheels to push me, nor rails to give me a faster road. Air is what I wanted, that was all. Air surrounds me as it surrounds the submarine boat, and in it my propellers act like the screws of a steamer. That is how I solved the problem of aviation. That is what a balloon will never do, nor will any machine that is lighter than air." Silence, absolute, on the part of the colleagues, which did not for a moment disconcert the engineer. He contented himself with a half-smile and continued in his interrogative style. "Perhaps you ask if to this power of the Albatross to move horizontally there is added an equal power of vertical movement. In a word, if, when we visit the higher zones of the atmosphere, we can compete with an aerostat. Well, I should not advise you to enter the go-ahead against her." The two colleagues shrugged their shoulders. That was probably what the engineer was waiting for. ROBUR made a sign. The propelling screws immediately stopped, and after running for a mile, the Albatross pulled up motionless. At a second gesture from ROBUR, the suspensory helices revolved at a speed that can only be compared to that of a siren in acoustical experiments. Their effort or ra rose nearly an octave in the scale of sound, diminishing gradually in intensity as the air became more rarefied, and the machine rose vertically, like a lark singing his song in space. "Master! Master!" shouted Fry Colin. "See that it doesn't break!" A smile of disdain was ROBUR's only reply. In a few minutes the Albatross had attained the height of 8,700 feet and extended the range of vision by 70 miles, the barometer having fallen 480 millimeters. Then the Albatross descended. The diminution of the pressure in high altitudes leads to the diminution of oxygen in the air and consequently in the blood. This has been the cause of several serious accidents which have happened to aeronauts, and ROBUR saw no reason to run any risk. The Albatross thus returned to the height she seemed to prefer, and her propellers beginning again drove her off to the southwest. "Now, sirs, if that is what you wanted, you can reply." Then, leaning over the rail, he remained absorbed in contemplation. When he raised his head, the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute stood by his side. "Engineer ROBUR," said Uncle Prudent, in vain endeavoring to control himself, "we have nothing to ask about what you seem to believe, but we wish to ask you a question which we think you would do well to answer." "Speak." "By what right did you attack us in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park? By what right did you shut us up in that prison? By what right have you brought us against our will on board this flying machine? And by what right, messieurs balloonists, did you insult and threaten me in your club in such a way that I am astonished I came out of it alive?" "To ask is not to answer," said Phil Evans, "and I repeat, by what right?" "Do you wish to know?" "If you please." "Well, by the right of the strongest." "That is cynical." "But it is true." "And for how long, citizen engineer?" asked Uncle Prudent, who was nearly exploding. "For how long do you intend to exercise that right?" "How can you?" said ROBUR, ironically. "How can you ask me such a question when you have only to cast down your eyes to enjoy a spectacle unparalleled in the world?" The Albatross was then sweeping across the immense expanse of Lake Ontario. She had just crossed the country so poetically described by Cooper. Then she followed the southern shore and headed for the celebrated river which pours into it the waters of Lake Erie, breaking them to powder in its cataracts. In an instant a majestic sound, a roar as of the tempest, mounted towards them, and, as if a humid fog had been projected into the air, the atmosphere sensibly freshened. Below were the liquid masses. They seemed like an enormous flowing sheet of crystal amid 1,000 rainbows due to refraction as it decomposed the solar rays. The sight was sublime. Before the falls, a footbridge, stretching like a thread, united one bank to the other. 3 miles below was a suspension bridge, across which a train was crawling from the Canadian to the American bank. "The Falls of Niagara!" exclaimed Phil Evans. And as the exclamation escaped him, Uncle Prudent was doing all could do to admire nothing of these wonders. A minute afterwards, the Albatross had crossed the river which separates the United States from Canada and was flying over the vast territories of the West. Chapter 9. Across the Prairie. In one of the cabins of the after-house, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans had found 2 excellent berths, with clean linen, change of clothes, and traveling cloaks and rugs. No Atlantic liner could have offered them more comfort. If they did not sleep soundly, it was that they did not wish to do so, or rather that their very real anxiety prevented them. In what adventure had they embarked? To what series of experiments had they been invited? How would the business end? And above all, what was ROBUR going to do with them? Fry Colin, the valet, was quartered forward in a cabin adjoining that of the cook. The neighborhood did not displease him. He liked to rub shoulders with the great in this world. But if he finally went to sleep, it was to dream of fall after fall, of projections through space, which made his sleep a horrible nightmare. However, nothing could be quieter than this journey through the atmosphere, whose currents had grown weaker with the evening. Beyond the rustling of the blades of the screws, there was not a sound, except now and then the whistle from some terrestrial locomotive, or the calling of some animal. Strange instinct. These terrestrial beings felt the aeronef glide over them and uttered cries of terror as it passed. On the morrow, the 14th of June, at 5 o'clock, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans were walking on the deck of the Albatross. Nothing had changed since the evening. There was a lookout forward, and the helmsman was in his glass cage. Why was there a lookout? Was there any chance of collision with another such machine? Certainly not. ROBUR had not yet found imitators. The chance of encountering an aerostat gliding through the air was too remote to be regarded. In any case, it would be all the worse for the aerostat, the earthen pot and the iron pot. The Albatross had nothing to fear from the collision. But what could happen? The aeronef might find herself like a ship on a lee shore if a mountain that could not be outflanked or passed barred the way. These are the reefs of the air, and they have to be avoided as a ship avoids the reefs of the sea. The engineer, it is true, had given the course, and in doing so had taken into account the altitude necessary to clear the summits of the highlands in the district. But, as the aeronef was rapidly nearing a mountainous country, it was only prudent to keep a good lookout in case some slight deviation from the course became necessary. Looking at the country beneath them, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans noticed a large lake whose lower southern end the Albatross had just reached. They concluded, therefore, that during the night the whole length of Lake Erie had been traversed, and that, as they were going due west, they would soon be over Lake Michigan. "There can be no doubt of it," said Phil Evans, "and that group of roofs on the horizon is Chicago." He was right. It was indeed the city from which the 17 railways diverge, the queen of the West, the vast reservoir into which flow the products of Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, Missouri, and all the states which form the western half of the Union. Uncle Prudent, through an excellent telescope he had found in his cabin, easily recognized the principal buildings. His colleague pointed out to him the churches and public edifices, the numerous elevators, or mechanical granaries, and the huge Sherman Hotel, whose windows seemed like 100 glittering points on each of its faces. "If that is Chicago," said Uncle Prudent, "it is obvious that we are going farther west than is convenient for us if we are to return to our starting place." And, in fact, the Albatross was traveling in a straight line from the Pennsylvania capital. But if Uncle Prudent wished to ask ROBUR to take him eastwards, he could not then do so. That morning the engineer did not leave his cabin. Either he was occupied in some work, or else he was asleep, and the two colleagues sat down to breakfast without seeing him. The speed was the same as that during last evening. The wind being easterly, the rate was not interfered with at all, and as the thermometer only falls a degree centigrade for every 70 meters of elevation, the temperature was not insupportable. And so, in chatting and thinking and waiting for the engineer, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans walked about beneath the forest of screws, whose giratory movement gave their arms the appearance of semi-diaphanous discs. The state of Illinois was left by its northern frontier in less than 2 hours and a half, and they crossed the father of waters, the Mississippi, whose double-decked steamboats seemed no bigger than canoes. Then the Albatross flew over Iowa after having sighted Iowa City about 11 o'clock in the morning. A few chains of hills, bluffs as they are called, curved across the face of the country, trending from the south to the northwest, whose moderate height necessitated no rise in the course of the aeronef. Soon the bluffs gave place to the large plains of western Iowa and Nebraska, immense prairies extending all the way to the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Here and there were many rios, affluents or minor affluents of the Missouri. On their banks were towns and villages, growing more scattered as the Albatross sped farther west. Nothing particular happened during this day. Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans were left entirely to themselves. They hardly noticed Fry Collins sprawling at full length in the bow, keeping his eyes shut so that he could see nothing. And they were not attacked by vertigo, as might have been expected. There was no guiding mark, and there was nothing to cause the vertigo, as there would have been on the top of a lofty building. The abyss has no attractive power when it is gazed at from the car of a balloon or deck of an aeronef. It is not an abyss that opens beneath the aeronaut, but an horizon that rises round him on all sides like a cup. In a couple of hours the Albatross was over Omaha on the Nebraskan frontier. Omaha City, the real head of the Pacific Railway, that long line of rails, 4,500 miles in length, stretching from New York to San Francisco. For a moment they could see the yellow waters of the Missouri, then the town, with its houses of wood and brick in the center of a rich basin, like a buckle in the iron belt which clasps North America round the waist. Doubtless, also, as the passengers in the aeronef could observe all these details, the inhabitants of Omaha noticed the strange machine. Their astonishment at seeing it gliding overhead could be no greater than that of the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute at finding themselves on board. Anyhow, the journals of the Union would be certain to notice the fact. It would be the explanation of the astonishing phenomenon which the whole world had been wondering over for some time. In an hour, the Albatross had left Omaha and crossed the Platte River, whose valley is followed by the Pacific Railway in its route across the prairie. Things looked serious for Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans. "It is serious, then, this absurd project of taking us to the Antipodes." "And whether we like it or not," exclaimed the other. "ROBUR had better take care. I am not the man to stand that sort of thing." "Nor am I," replied Phil Evans. "But be calm, Uncle Prudent. Be calm. Be calm, and keep your temper until it is wanted." By 5 o'clock they had crossed the Black Mountains covered with pines and cedars, and the Albatross was over the appropriately named Badlands of Nebraska, a chaos of ochre-colored hills, of mountainous fragments fallen on the soil and broken in their fall. At a distance, these blocks take the most fantastic shapes. Here and there, amid this enormous game of knucklebones, there could be traced the imaginary ruins of medieval cities with forts and dungeons, pepper-box turrets, and machicolated towers. And in truth, these Badlands are an immense ossuary, where lie bleaching in the sun myriads of fragments of pachyderms, chelonians, and even, some would have us believe, fossil men, overwhelmed by unknown cataclysms ages and ages ago. When evening came, the whole basin of the Platte River had been crossed, and the plain extended to the extreme limits of the horizon, which rose high owing to the altitude of the Albatross. During the night, there were no more shrill whistles of locomotives or deeper notes of the river steamers to trouble the quiet of the starry firmament. Long bellowing occasionally reached the aeronef from the herds of buffalo that roamed over the prairie in search of water and pasturage. And when they ceased, the trampling of the grass under their feet produced a dull roaring, similar to the rushing of a flood, and very different from the continuous of the screws. Then from time to time came the howl of a wolf, a fox, a wild cat, or a coyote, the Canis latrans, whose name is justified by his sonorous bark. Occasionally came penetrating odors of mint and sage and absinthe, mingled with the more powerful fragrance of the conifers which rose floating through the night air. At last came a menacing yell, which was not due to the coyote. It was the shout of a redskin, which no tenderfoot would confound with the cry of a wild beast. Chapter 10. Westward, but whither? The next day, the 15th of June, about 5 o'clock in the morning, Phil Evans left his cabin. Perhaps he would today have a chance of speaking to ROBUR. Desirous of knowing why he had not appeared the day before, Evans addressed himself to the mate, Tom Turner. Tom Turner was an Englishman of about 45, broad in the shoulders and short in the legs, a man of iron, with one of those enormous characteristic heads that Hogarth rejoiced in. "Shall we see Mr. ROBUR today?" asked Phil Evans. "I don't know," said Turner. "I need not ask if he has gone out." "Perhaps he has." "And when will he come back?" "When he has finished his cruise." And Tom went into his cabin. With this reply they had to be contented. Matters did not look promising, particularly as on reference to the compass, it appeared that the Albatross was still steering southwest. Great was the contrast between the barren tract of the Badlands passed over during the night and the landscape then unrolling beneath them. The aeronef was now more than 600 miles from Omaha and over a country which Phil Evans could not recognize because he had never been there before. A few forts to keep the Indians in order crowned the bluffs with their geometric lines, formed oftener of palisades than walls. There were few villages and few inhabitants, the country differing widely from the auriferous lands of Colorado many leagues to the south. In the distance, a long line of mountain crests, in great confusion as yet, began to appear. They were the Rocky Mountains. For the first time that morning, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans were sensible of a certain lowness of temperature which was not due to a change in the weather, for the sun shone in superb splendor. "It is because of the albatross being higher in the air," said Phil Evans. In fact, the barometer outside the central deckhouse had fallen 540 millimeters, thus indicating an elevation of about 10,000 feet above the sea. The aeronef was at this altitude owing to the elevation of the ground. An hour before, she had been at a height of 13,000 feet, and behind her were mountains covered with perpetual snow. There was nothing Uncle Prudent and his companion could remember which would lead them to discover where they were. During the night, the albatross had made several stretches north and south at tremendous speed, and that was what had put them out of their reckoning. After talking over several hypotheses, more or less plausible, they came to the conclusion that this country encircled with mountains must be the district declared by an act of Congress in March 1872 to be the national park of the United States. A strange region it was. It well merited the name of a park with mountains for hills, with lakes for ponds, with rivers for streamlets, and with geysers of marvelous power instead of fountains. In a few minutes, the albatross glided across the Yellowstone River, leaving Mount Stevenson on the right and coasting the large lake which bears the name of the stream. Great was the variety on the banks of this basin, ribbed as they were with obsidian and tiny crystals, reflecting the sunlight on their myriad facets. Wonderful was the arrangement of the islands on its surface. Magnificent were the blue reflections of the gigantic mirror, and around the lake, one of the highest in the globe, were multitudes of pelicans, swans, gulls and geese, bernacles and divers. In places the steep banks were clothed with green trees, pines and larches, and at the foot of the escarpments there shot upwards innumerable white fumaroles, the vapour escaping from the soil as from an enormous reservoir in which the water is kept in permanent ebullition by subterranean fire. The cook might have seized the opportunity of securing an ample supply of trout, the only fish the Yellowstone Lake contains in myriads. But the albatross kept on at such a height that there was no chance of indulging in a catch which assuredly would have been miraculous. In 3/4 of an hour the lake was overpassed, and a little farther on the last was seen of the geyser region which rivals the finest in Iceland. Leaning over the rail, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans watched the liquid columns which leaped up as though to furnish the aeronef with a new element. There were the fan, with the jets shot forth in rays, the fortress, which seemed to be defended by waterspouts, the faithful friend, with her plume crowned with the rainbows, the giant, spurting forth a vertical torrent 20 feet round and more than 200 feet high. ROBUR must evidently have been familiar with this incomparable spectacle, unique in the world, for he did not appear on deck. Was it, then, for the sole pleasure of his guests that he had brought the aeronef above the national domain? If so, he came not to receive their thanks. He did not even trouble himself during the daring passage of the Rocky Mountains, which the albatross approached at about 7 o'clock. By increasing the speed of her wings, as a bird rising in its flight, the albatross would clear the highest ridges of the chain and sink again over Oregon or Utah. But the maneuver was unnecessary. The passes allowed the barrier to be crossed without ascending for the higher ridges. There are many of these canyons, or steep valleys, more or less narrow, through which they could glide, such as Bridger Gap, through which runs the Pacific Railway into the Mormon Territory, and others to the north and south of it. It was through one of these that the albatross headed, after slackening speed so as not to dash against the walls of the canyon. The steersman, with a sureness of hand rendered more effective by the sensitiveness of the rudder, maneuvered his craft as if she were a crack racer in a Royal Victoria match. It was really extraordinary, in spite of all the jealousy of the two enemies of lighter than air. They could not help being surprised at the perfection of this engine of aerial locomotion. In less than 2 hours and a half, they were through the Rockies, and the albatross resumed her former speed of 62 miles an hour. She was steering southwest so as to cut across Utah diagonally as she neared the ground. She had even dropped several hundred yards when the sound of a whistle attracted the attention of Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans. It was a train on the Pacific Railway on the road to Salt Lake City. And then, in obedience to an order secretly given, The albatross dropped still lower so as to chase the train, which was going at full speed. She was immediately sighted. A few heads showed themselves at the doors of the cars. Then numerous passengers crowded the gangways. Some did not hesitate to climb on the roof to get a better view of the flying machine. Cheers came floating up through the air, but no ROBUR appeared in answer to them. The albatross continued her descent, slowing her suspensory screws and moderating her speed so as not to leave the train behind. She flew about it like an enormous beetle or a gigantic bird of prey. She headed off to the right and left and swept on in front and hung behind and proudly displayed her flag with the golden sun, to which the conductor of the train replied by waving the stars and stripes. In vain the prisoners, in their desire to take advantage of the opportunity, endeavored to make themselves known to those below. In vain the president of the Weldon Institute roared forth at the top of his voice, "I am Uncle Prudent of Philadelphia," and the secretary followed suit with, "I am Phil Evans, his colleague." Their shouts were lost in the 1,000 cheers with which the passengers greeted the aeronef. 3 or 4 of the crew of the Albatross had appeared on the deck, and one of them, like sailors when passing a ship less speedy than their own, held out a rope, an ironical way of offering to tow them. And then the Albatross resumed her original speed, and in half an hour the express was out of sight. About 1 o'clock there appeared a vast disk which reflected the solar rays as if it were an immense mirror. "That ought to be the Mormon capital, Salt Lake City," said Uncle Prudent. And so it was, and the disk was the roof of the tabernacle, where 10,000 saints can worship at their ease. This vast dome, like a convex mirror, threw off the rays of the sun in all directions. It vanished like a shadow, and the Albatross sped on her way to the southwest with a speed that was not felt because it surpassed that of the chasing wind. Soon she was in Nevada, over the silver regions, which the Sierra separates from the golden lands of California. "We shall certainly reach San Francisco before night," said Phil Evans. "And then?" asked Uncle Prudent. It was 6 o'clock precisely when the Sierra Nevada was crossed by the same pass as that taken by the railway. Only 180 miles then separated them from San Francisco, the Californian capital. At the speed the Albatross was going, she would be over the dome by 8 o'clock. At this moment, ROBUR appeared on deck. The colleagues walked up to him. "Engineer ROBUR," said Uncle Prudent, "we are now on the very confines of America. We think the time has come for this joke to end." "I never joke," said ROBUR. He raised his hand. The Albatross swiftly dropped towards the ground, and at the same time such speed was given her as to drive the prisoners into their cabin. As soon as the door was shut, Uncle Prudent exclaimed, "I could strangle him." "We must try to escape," said Phil Evans. "Yes, cost what it may." A long murmur greeted their ears. It was the beating of the surf on the seashore. It was the Pacific Ocean.